helps you guys to get to something more current. But there are a couple of things I need to hit on in order to get us there. How many branches of government are there? What are they?
Yes, we got that right.
Okay, I heard in the government act there, I heard
to get it in order, I always kind of preach LEJ. That way they got it in order, and we've talked about how you can't just go from 1 to 4 and skip 2 and 3.
So the legislative branch creates the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judicial branch reviews the law, essentially. There are nuances to that we're probably not going to get into. So true or false, the framers of the Constitution designed the presidency to be the most powerful branch of government.
False is the only government.
Why? What's your name?
Oh, Drew.
Drew and
Davis.
Davis?
Davis is the only one that can compete with him here on height.
Okay, Davis. Why do you think that's false?
Because it was the only government. There wasn't any other government.
Oh, okay. I see what you did there. Yeah. So if we look at what the framers did when they created our government, the sole government, do you think they created it unequally or equally?
Tried to create it equally.
Okay. There's Drew.
Yeah.
Why did they try and create it equally?
So that no one got too much power and it wasn't tiring.
Very good answer. So if we look at what they created, they tried to create 3 co-equal branches, right? And part of that dates back to this man right here, King George III, who was the monarch of Great Britain, at the time just Britain. But, so what could King George do that we can't do today?
Anything you wanted.
Anything he wanted. And so, by the way, you normally segregate like this?
This is the junior high dance class where guys on one wall, girls on
Gotcha.
the other.
Okay.
You'll see it again. Well, you won't be around, but Fourth Hour does the same thing.
Really?
That's
fascinating.
Weird.
All right. So our first form of government was the Articles of Confederation. That's what we first devised to replace the king. And the reason why we devised it was because we were so concerned about a monarch that we completely decentralized. There was no central power. There was a federal government in name, but you couldn't collect taxes, you couldn't raise an army, you couldn't create treaties with other countries. It had no real figurehead at the center. And so what happened is things kind of descended into anarchy. You had 13 federal governments all trying to do the same thing, all trying to create treaties with other countries. So they were competing with one another over exports from France, from Spain, from Portugal. And so what wound up happening is these 13 different states created their own system of currency. They decided when they wanted to accept currency from another state. They just arbitrarily decided the value of their currency created versus other states' currency, and you might kind of get the sense that, well, my money is worth more than your money because it's my money. Except for everybody thinks that. So what winds up happening is you can't get anything done. And there was actually a risk of England coming back in at that time and basically reasserting themselves over what they still deemed the colonies. And so as part of that, the framers gathered together in the late 1780s, and they worked for 2 years to create what we now call the Constitution. And within that, we gave the president significant powers. What are 2 powers that are enumerated in Article 2 that the president has? My man right back here. What's your name?
Connor.
Connor.
Connor's in.
What's 1? What can the president do because of the Constitution?
Does he have the right to veto and pass laws?
So he has the right to veto a law.
Yeah.
That's true. That's accurate. What's another one? What's another one?
It's like you're being cross-examined right now.
This side of the room. This side of the room. What's another?
That's what
power
you gotta
president?
do with this group. You just turn to one side of the room and then turn back.
Yeah.
And they know you're coming back at them, so
Okay,
they're just
perfect.
kinda getting prepped.
Name? Melissa. What do you think is another power of the president?
Don't look at me. You see enough lawyer shows that you can't look, don't look at him, look at me.
They can help you if they want.
Oh, here we go, lifelines.
Anybody? No? No? Okay, so what do we often
There's some
call?
red faces right there too, they got real red.
What do we often call the president within the context of the military? That's his name, but he has a title.
A job title.
General.
Commander-in-Chief. He is specifically not a general. A general is a military officer. The commander-in-chief is a civilian. And that is one thing that was paramount. You would always have a civilian who was not part of the military that would lead the military. Why would you do that?
So the military, I don't know, so the military didn't try to overthrow the,
It's a check.
yeah.
Checks and balances all throughout the government. You see the intricacy, you see the nuance as you get farther into the Constitution. Wherever there's a power, there's a check on that power. So if Connor, as Connor said earlier, the president can veto a law, right? Well, it's the legislative's power to create the law. So that's a check on that ability. But what can Congress do after a law has been vetoed?
They can send it through the court, say,
Okay, I got a lot going on over here. What's your name?
Ethan.
Ethan. What can Congress do after the president has vetoed a law?
Can't they override it?
They can. Do you know how many votes they have to have? No, not yours.
one vote.
Not one vote. Well, it is a vote. Coming back to this side. How many votes do you have to override a veto?
Come on, ladies, put them to shame.
It's a fraction.
Show the
I'll give you
shame.
a hint. Yes.
I'm assuming that's three-fourths?
Close. What's your name? Dylan, you're about to say it. What is it?
Two-thirds.
Yes. 2/3 of both chambers.
Table one.
So you have to have both chambers vote 2/3 and you can override a veto. So there we have another example of check, a balance, and a check. Right? So, what else can the president do? What are some of his other powers?
Can pass bills.
Can he?
I don't know.
Is that a rhetorical question?
So, and I told the first period this. In law school, the thing that matters is not whether you're correct. It matters how you show your work. So, if you say he can pass the laws, he can pass bills, what do you mean by that?
It's like an extension of me all over again, except in a suit,
Worse
isn't
than
it?
you.
What do you think about that?
Details.
I've had a lot of practice. So, if we look at what the president can do, one of the things he can do is he can actually appoint people to positions all throughout the government. That's one of the things that he has an enumerated power to do.
Wait, so you're saying like you could, like his friend, like you could just put them in places or just people who are qualified?
Well, that's the question. Which is it? What do you think?
I don't know, because like George Washington didn't like, I think we learned that like he put like people that he knew and trusted like in those spots but weren't qualified.
Mhm.
But now I don't know if it's changed or not.
So, what do you think the check is do you think the check on appointments would be? So let's keep it simple. I don't want to go into administrative law and all of that morass. Let's think about two of the recent appointments we had, right?
Taking the Supreme Court.
Supreme Court justices. So we had Neil Gorsuch and we had Brett Kavanaugh. What did they have to do in order to get their jobs?
They had to go through a bunch of trials.
Didn't have to be voted in.
They had to be voted in by who?
The
Probably the Supreme Court.
I told them they'd start warming up once we.
Yeah, they are much more. So I heard a smattering from over here, and since they're saying everything, I'm gonna come back to you guys, girls. What's your name?
Bailey.
Bailey. What was the hearing process for the Supreme Court justices? What was that for? Why? Who was it in front of?
I thought this simple, no.
It was in front of the United States Senate, right? So the Senate has to approve of the appointment, right? So that's why we had those hearings. Everything was publicized. And at the end of it, there was a vote, and they got the majority they needed. And so those two are now Supreme Court justices. I didn't get to this in the first period, but it's one of the things that I find fascinating. How long do you think the average appointment lasts?
Is it for their lifetime?
So the Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. How long do you think that actually lasts, though? What's the average length of that?
30 years.
17 years. Drew's not far off. So that's essentially, we consider a 20-year span a generation. So those are generational appointments. They will far outlast the president, even if he gets 2 terms. On average, more than double the time. So that is a key thing that has to have both branches. It has to have the legislative and the executive. The executive has to appoint, legislative has to approve, right? So there we see another check and balance. So, just because I found it funny in the first period, who are these guys?
Come on.
Yes.
So Ronald Reagan,
That's my boy.
what's your name?
Why?
Wyatt. Very good job. Who's the other guy?
There's about 87 sleeves, so we'll see the next one here in an hour or
Who is
two.
that? I can't see that far. I don't know.
Old guy.
An old guy. He has one of the most recognizable foreheads.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're talking about the guy in the, oh, okay. I have no
Didn't they
idea.
make it look, I thought they made it look like California.
Yeah, at one point. So that is a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that.
Do any of you know who that is?
Probably a Russian guy.
He is a Russian, not just any Russian,
He's not the president. He's the
Wait.
president.
but he was.
Oh, yeah.
When Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States, he was the president of Russia. As the president of Russia, who do you answer to?
Nobody.
Right. So is it really a republic if you
No,
don't
it's-
answer to anybody?
No, it's a dictatorship.
Right. So these two individuals are responsible for ending the Cold War, which was long before you were probably a twinkling in anyone's eye.
Easy.
So,
Easy now.
so that was an influential thing that we allowed the president to go and communicate with the president of Russia. So why is that? Why do we allow the president to go all over the world and to communicate with leaders of other countries?
To keep peace.
It's a good reason. What's his title? Steelers jersey. What's your name? Logan? What do you think? What's the title of the president in that capacity when he's treating with other countries? Anything? Chiefs? What's your name?
Zoe.
Zoe? Give me a guess.
No, what was the question?
So, if we allow the president to go all over the world and to communicate with other world leaders, what is that function? What would you call that? Close.
I can think of it.
He's a diplomat.
Oh, I was close.
He's the nation's chief diplomat. Yeah, well, you learned something.
I think we make that word once.
So,
Yeah.
if, as the nation's chief diplomat, he can go around the world and he can engage in foreign affairs and he can negotiate treaties. What is the balance to treaties? If you're the president of the United States, can you just go over and say, yeah, we'll agree? Wyatt's shaking his head no. Why?
Because they have to agree to it, so, like, treaty of facilities, someone lost something, so.
So you're thinking of a contract.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. But in the context of the executive branch, what would it be a check on the president's power to just enter into treaties?
Doesn't it have to go through Congress for that?
So it has to be approved by Congress, we go back to that, and then it can be ratified if they make any changes. So that is the ratification process for treaties, another example of the checks and balances. So we discussed this a little bit earlier, I think, but the Constitution gives the president a substantial role in the lawmaking process. We talked about vetoes, talked about what it takes to overcome them. So in addition to that, president's required by the Constitution to faithfully execute the laws passed by Congress. So as the executive, when you're enforcing the laws, what does that entail? That's kind of what gets us to the next part. Do you think the framers' decision to impose so many limits on the presidency was the right choice?
We haven't done it yet.
We haven't died yet. That seems like a very low bar,
They'd
sir.
go into two more wars.
So,
We've done it.
right here, what's your name?
Max.
Max, what do you think?
I think so far it's the right choice.
Okay. What would you do differently? Would you give the president more or less power?
I think so far I can only do two things, so. Yeah, I don't know.
You don't know.
I'd say less power would be the safest thing to do.
Okay, why would it be safest to give the president less power?
Because that gives people more power in a way, kind of.
Okay. I like that answer. I do. And it kind of goes back to the idea behind the Articles of Confederation. We don't trust centralized power. So even though the framers did away with the Articles of Confederation, they sprinkled the idea of it all throughout the Constitution. And that is too much power in one place is a bad thing. So, Max? Max has a very good perspective on that, even though he may not yet be a constitutional scholar, in that he's got an inkling. We've designed it to be that way. We designed it to decentralize power across three co-equal branches. So, as we move forward, we will see where that has kind of gone awry. So when do you think the president or the executive branch has the most power? Do you think it's in time of peace or time of war?
Probably war,
Why?
because everybody's vested their shoulders on them.
That's an excellent answer. So during national emergencies, going all the way back to the Civil War, when does this class period end? So
9/11. 9/11. Well, that's
okay, we're good.
one that I ever noticed that. 9/11.
That's an odd, we'll get there too.
Talk to Dr. McKenzie about let's just go 9/12. It'll be okay.
So Abraham Lincoln, going back to the 1860s, what happened in the early 1860s?
Civil War.
Okay. And did Abraham Lincoln represent the North or the South?
Was any of
I was
the
gonna gonna say, Coach Allison, I will have him here in 30 seconds. Come back after each one of you.
So he was the president of the United States.
Neither.
Was he neither?
He was the leader of the union, wasn't
He was the leader of the union.
He was the Indian.
But he was also the president of the United
he?
States.
Yeah. So
Very
he was
true.
going against his own people.
He said Russian.
Well,
But it's
so
a
that's
war, so it's
Not.
that's sort of what sets the groundwork. That sets the groundwork for some of the issues we're going to discuss. So Lincoln did several things under his executive authority. One of them is he blockaded southern ports. And he did that without congressional authorization. So if you blockade southern ports, what presidential power gives you the right to do that?
None. Well,
Is the answer none?
his, I don't know.
Well, it's all an interpretation. You gotta figure out the interpretation portion of it.
What about right here? What's your name?
Autumn.
Otto. What do you think?
Shame.
Do you think the president could or could not do this legally?
He did.
You can pick one of the two answers. Could? You think you could or could not? Yeah, you think you could?
I mean, he did, so.
Yeah, he did.
Exactly.
Well, so was it legal? That's the question we're getting to. And so, if we look at what authority he has in time of war, he's the commander-in-chief. So was this a military exercise or was it a diplomatic exercise? If you're trying to cut off the supplies of your enemy in a time of war,
So,
I mean, it could be both.
could be both. That's why we have judicial review. Now, when everybody's on your side because you represent the North,
Yeah.
and the court is also in the North, what do you think the outcome is going to be? And so that's where we get into number 2, which is suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. And I'll give you the same background I gave the first period. There was a legislator who was basically accused of treason. He was trying to sabotage Northern plans involving the military. And so he was captured by the military. And he was imprisoned at Fort McKinney. And his lawyers, the guy that got captured, his lawyers said, well, hang on a minute. We're going to file a writ of habeas corpus, which means to bring the body forth to the court system. So now you have to transport him from this military detention to the court. And Lincoln said, no. I'm suspending the writ of habeas corpus. You can no longer petition the court to be brought before it for any charges or crimes. And so what authority gives, what executive power does the president have to do that? Name? Olivia. What power do you think Lincoln had under the Constitution to do this? It kind of ties back into the first one, right? So we're in a time of war. And so you see where the lines start to get a little hazy when we've got this national emergency of a civil war. And so we start to let the president do more and more. And that is a theme that will repeat, and we'll see that. So another thing that Lincoln did was he freed the slaves. How many slaves did he free? What percentage do you think? 60 for Wyatt. So why do you think it was 60%?
I just couldn't remember how to-
Well,
But, I mean, you can't free all of them, because, some of them it takes longer.
there's a higher portion.
because didn't they only free the North?
Yeah.
So you only freed the South.
because the North was already.
So a lot of people don't realize that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed those slaves that were in southern territories or southern states. It doesn't say all. Why doesn't it say all?
Because the North didn't deliver.
But there were slaves in the North. So is this part of his military power to free the enemy of his enemy and thereby create another source?
Yeah.
So, and that's the truth. Now the argument is, well, that's so stretched as to what the commander-in-chief's powers are that to be ridiculous. But at the same time, a lot of those freed slaves did take up arms and they did fight against the South. And so that's really where these sort of conundrums, these constitutional conundrums come up. And so if we move forward, actually this is a decent quote. Lincoln said, "I may in an emergency do things on military grounds which cannot be done constitutionally by Congress." So do you see where he starts to skirt the Constitution because he's got this crisis? He's got an excuse. So how should we view Lincoln's actions?
Unconstitutional.
Why?
Because he was doing it without Congress.
So that is the question. So you think it was unconstitutional, right? Does anyone think it was constitutional?
No.
Oh, they're not part of that norm up now.
He
They're-
relied on Congress, and it was unconstitutional.
Okay, so you're taking the position, you two are taking the position, correct me if I'm wrong, that unless you have congressional approval, you as the president can't make any final action. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Okay, now.
Okay.
All right,
So Davis is abandoning Wyatt. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. I want to save that for a little bit later. The attack on Pearl Harbor, we're fast forwarding now, 80 plus years. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is the president on December 7th, 1941. He says, "A day that will live in infamy." Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. When is the last time that America declared war?
Then.
December 7th, 1941. We've not had a declaration of war since then. Have we had wars since then?
Yeah.
Or have we had conflicts? We've had the war on terrorism. Who's that against?
Iraq. Mostly.
Oh, like terrorism.
The Middle East. So we've got kind of a broad consensus here. We don't really know. And that's part of being indefinite with the war on terrorism. That wasn't actually a declaration of war. So if we look at what we did, Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed within days Executive Order 9066. And so that is where we interned is the phrase we used. Yeah, internment camps. What happened that we did that? Why did we do that?
Because we thought that they were a threat.
Because they were.
Why did we think they were a threat?
Because they're Japanese.
Spies.
So we used fear, we had a national crisis, and we went all up and down the West Coast and we interned all of these Japanese Americans. So weren't we fighting against that? Weren't we fighting Germany, who had put a bunch of people in concentration camps?
And so we just did the same thing, made us look like hypocrites.
Is that the problem? So if you're on the Supreme Court in the 1940s and the Korematsu case comes before you, is that constitutional? What do you think the Supreme Court decided?
Probably before the government.
Right. Supreme Court said, because we're in such a unique circumstance, that is 100% okay. Would any of you have taken a different position?
I mean, I don't think it was probably right, because like most of those people were probably just innocent.
But I mean, Germany just did it because they weren't here and it was kind of a military act. It was because of fear.
Okay, so we've got two different viewpoints over
Ours
here.
was because of fear, theirs was because they wanted to impose fear.
That's interesting.
Well,
So,
Now on camera, got Stud and Hoss.
Yeah.
So this is,
This is gonna be a good one.
so when the Supreme Court reviewed this decision, they said that it was the correct decision to make under the circumstances. So if we fast forward a little bit further, we're going to get closer and closer to maybe some times that you remember. And we look at September 11th, 2001.
See, this is the first group that was not born yet. Oh. So now you get the old
Okay.
adage real quick.
All right. So I remember this. I remember exactly where I was. I was in 9th grade. I was in French class. And believe it or not, my government teacher ran in the room, turned on the television and said, "You got to watch this. You're never going to believe what's happening." And then we watched the second airplane hit the tower. Live. And so that was a day that changed America again. So George W. Bush was president. After that, what did we do?
Then we got a war on Iraq that wasn't declared.
So now we're thinking, was it declared war? Was it not declared war? So we engaged first with Afghanistan, and we invaded them under the guise of the war on terrorism, and then we invaded Iraq. And during that time, President Bush made several executive decisions. So first and foremost, he made the choice to go into those countries. And like you said, there was no declaration of war. So could he do that? Constitutionally. And my left side has gone quiet again. Who have I not picked on? I've not picked on you. What's your name?
Guys, girls, one side.
Zoe, do you think that was constitutional for them to invade Iraq and Afghanistan?
Not really.
Okay, why?
I really hate that white question.
Yeah.
Really like.
Well, so I see the wheels turning, and it's good that you're struggling. It makes you think, and that's the point of the why, is to think about why is this constitutional, is it not constitutional? Is it constitutional because Congress passed an authorization for use of military force? Even though it wasn't a declaration of war, they said, we're giving you the ability as the president to do what we think is necessary, what you think is necessary.
Well, if it's passed, then it can be done.
That's the question. Can the legislature give that authority away? Can they give the power to make war away?
I mean, they shouldn't be able to because they should all be
No,
equal power.
that should be
Right.
the president's job.
So that's the question. We've got two dichotomies here. We've got, they shouldn't be able to give that away, it's their power. And then we've got, well, it's the president who's the commander in chief. And so that is one of the great debates in times of strife is how much authority can the other branches give away, particularly the legislative branch, because the legislative branch is the one that declares war. So if we also look at some of the other things that the Bush administration did, they did enhanced interrogation techniques of terrorist suspects. What does that mean?
They were interrogated very well.
They were interrogated very well, Zoe says.
Some using well water, yes.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit in the last class period, but waterboarding. Does anyone know what that is?
Yes.
So sticking someone's face underwater.
Davis, I don't know that you're supposed to have that much of intent. Really, I think I'm supposed to have it all the way.
Right. So it's a simulation of drowning, but you never drown. It's a way to trick the mind.
Yes.
And so another thing we did was we left you awake and woke you up for days. So how do you think it feels to be awake for days?
They were probably pretty bad.
Not a lot of fun.
Not a lot of fun. You actually start to lose your mind. And so if we're saying we're going to keep you awake for days unless you give us who the other terrorists are, what do you think happens?
Eventually, it's gonna snap.
Okay, so I got a smattering of everywhere. Right here, my man. What's your name? Seth. Do you think you talk or don't talk if you've been kept awake for days?
They probably end up talking, but,
Right. Everybody talks.
oh yeah.
So if you're getting that sort of information, is it good information? Is it a good idea for the executive to do that? Is it constitutional? That's what we always have to come back to. Is that allowed under Article 2? That's where it gets a little bit more difficult. That's where you all get quiet. Right? Because we don't know until we challenge it. So in some of these cases, there were circumstances where individuals were placed in Guantanamo Bay so that they wouldn't be subject to the authority of the American court system. There were military tribunals that were set up to try them in lieu of courts of law. And so all of those things are kind of designed to circumvent the normal legal process. So if we look at, actually this is one we didn't get to that I would really like your thoughts on, electronic surveillance of American citizens without warrants. So what do you think this is?
Phone.
It's a phone.
Yeah.
Do you think I should be allowed to listen to everything that happens on this phone?
Well, we're gonna say that.
Why not?
Because that's our privacy.
So that's our privacy.
What if it stops a terrorist?
This goes back to your common good self-interest argument from
Right.
years ago.
Common good versus self-interest. Do we have a right to privacy? Or what if it could stop? My man over here is an executive through and through, Connor's executive branch through and through.
Oh my God.
So,
Stud, hoss, stud.
yeah, we've got a lot of studs and hosses.
And Chad. Chad.
So that's the conundrum. Is this good for the Constitution? Is it good for the country? And which side of the argument do you fall on? That's what this always comes back to, and you have to remember is, can the executive branch do this or can they not? And the key question is why, right? So do you believe that President Bush went too far in his reaction on 9/11? So our privacy advocate shook her head no.
Kind of did. I mean, but, you know, he's pretty much almost killing people in the water. That's a little far.
Right. So, yeah, so the beauty of this is we all disagree, right? So we all have our own perspective. The importance of that in a republic is what? What do we have the system by which we voice our opinions? How do we do that?
Republicans.
So we vote. We have a representative democracy. And so that goes back to the fundamental place that the framers put the people in, right? Because without the populace, you have no power. That's the central concept, right? All of that power, all of the co-equal branches, it's spread across, but it's given by the people, right? The old social contract. So,
Prior knowledge, oh, that's crazy.
Whack, isn't it?
Oh, now we got a whack in there. All right, fantastic.
so all of these guys have pushed the boundaries of their power, right?
Trump? Nah, he wouldn't do that.
Would he? So, I've got a few minutes. I want to answer any questions you have. Yeah.
So the Supreme Court justices, is there like a certain amount there can be, or is it like?
That's a very good question. So, there are 9,
They're 9, okay.
and it's very specifically laid out.
And so why was there like 2 open spots?
So, how long are they appointed for?
Like,
Well, like 17.
close.
So, they're appointed for life. They can serve for life. So, what happened that Neil Gorsuch got his hearing? He got to be appointed by the president and then ratified by the Senate. Antonin Scalia died.
That's a big word.
So,
2 different people.
Antonin Scalia was on a hunting trip in West Texas, and he died of a heart attack. So, that's the end of his tenure.
You probably saw like a big 14 point and then.
So, that's what gave way to that. And then, most recently, Justice Anthony Kennedy resigned. So he stepped down. So that created a vacancy. So there must be a vacancy in order to appoint someone new. Those are really the only 2 ways. There's a third, arguably, but those are the only 2 ways that you can have a spot. So the Constitution specifically lays out the requirements for that position. It lays out how many there can be. And so that's one of the cool things about the Constitution is the framers thought about a lot of this stuff. They spent years thinking about it. They actually published papers to the public to educate them on. So, what other questions do you guys have?
Ask away, you got a couple minutes.
Why is everybody trying to impeach Trump?
There it
Or
is.
President Trump?
So why is everybody, so
Got you, coach.
Nobody likes him.
Well, because like if he like did a crime, like he already had been impeached, and they just keep on trying to impeach him over and over
That was
again.
one of those
So-
trials.
So, what is the process of impeachment? How many steps are there?
You have to be.
Don't you have to be tried?
You have to be.
You have to be willing to be accused of like
Okay, one at a time.
crime.
We have talked ad nauseum about what impeachment really means, so trust me, they are gonna throw their knowledge at you.
Okay.
Accused of a crime.
So, accused of a high crime or misdemeanor.
Yes, and then
Not
tried.
even necessarily a high crime, just something that breaks the law.
All right.
Yeah.
Because higher law makes.
Guys, if you, I know several of you need to get to class, but if you wanna hang out for a minute and talk with him, I don't mind writing him pass